coming up.
I've broken some rules to make this. Carbon fiber and titanium, there's a rule you don't do that. Well, I did.
You don't move fast and break things if the thing you're going to break has got you inside it.
Not what we thought. A year on from the Titan tragedy,
We knew right where the sub was.
James Cameron reveals
Tapping sounds. Tapping sounds are ridiculous.
what really happened at the bottom of the ocean.
The entire world waiting with bated breath. We all knew they were dead.
So the Coast Guard lied.
Well, welcome to Extra Minutes, the 60 Minutes podcast. I'm joined by my colleague, Amelia Adams. I'm Adam Hegarty, the very, very busy Amelia Adams. We'll catch your story.
Aren't we all?
Exactly right. We'll catch your story on the OceanGate Titan disaster a year on 9Now and YouTube. But look, a year on, you've covered it extensively. Are we any closer to some firm answers?
I know it's hard to believe it's been a year, right? And there's so many active investigations. There's more than five. There's 5 official ones, and then you've got all sorts of offshoots as well. So a lot of people have been looking into this, understandably, for a long time. It was the first disaster of its kind. A commercial submersible had never catastrophically imploded in history. So huge blight for that community, and obviously, you know, the families of the 5 men who are on board. But the investigations haven't yet yielded any answers, which is what we went to have a look into.
Yeah, must frustrate a lot of people. You mentioned the families and experts. Why don't we have answers at this point?
Yeah, I mean, you imagine, you know, you go through that extraordinary trauma of, in the case of Sidonie Nargeolet, who we've spoken to, she's the daughter of one of the people on board, Paul-Henri Nargeolet. He's actually known as Mr. Titanic. He'd been a record 37 times.
Wow.
He was part of the team that brought up a lot of the initial artefacts from the wreck site. Just an extraordinarily experienced Titanic buff and deep sea explorer. So his daughter Sidonie has spoken to us to mark the year anniversary, really, but also because, as you say, she's really frustrated. You know, she hasn't had any answers. OceanGate, whose experimental submersible, the Titan, is at the centre of all this, has never actually contacted her to say, sorry, your father's dead, you know, this is what happened. And perhaps that's because the CEO, Stockton Rush, was in charge and, you know, he also went down with that sub.
You don't hear that often, do you? I mean, we do a lot of stories on companies or businesses that don't do the wrong thing or allegedly don't do the wrong thing. Normally they do eventually after a year contact families in some manner.
Yeah, and I think this is so unique. One of the things I struggled to get my head around and had to speak to a huge number of people is, you know, we as journalists cover plane crashes, terror attacks, the sort of aftermath investigation of these major world events. And I've done plenty of those in my time, but, you know, I've never covered a catastrophic implosion of a submersible because no one has, because it's never happened. So what does this investigation look like was kind of my first question. And the US Coast Guard, who are leading it, you know, obviously at the centre of it, and they were able to answer some of those questions just in terms of how wide the scope is. So it's from the moment they got the phone call, right? There's a missing submarine with 5 people on board. They'd never had a phone call like that in 30 years. So it's from that moment to what was wrong with that submersible? What could have caused it? We know that OceanGate had many accusations of, you know, safety concerns around the engineering of the Titan. The CEO, Stockton Rush, was well known to be a bit of a maverick, bit of a rogue, very experimental. I mean, he would say things like, and you'll see in the story, I've broken rules and I've experimented with this and no one's ever done this before. And the experts will say, there's a reason for that.
It's really haunting, that stuff, isn't it? I
is.
remember at the time when it happened, we saw that vision come out of him saying, you know, I'm breaking every rule under the sun because I want to be the first to do it. I'm paraphrasing, but really haunting at the time and probably still pretty hard to listen to.
It is, and quite a cavalier approach. So, you know, I suppose those are sort of the obvious things that you think of at the centre of the investigation, what was actually wrong with the craft. But then you've got to also look at what, you know, let's look at the physical evidence, the debris. The debris field was, you know, nearly 4 kilometres down in the bottom of the North Atlantic where the Titanic wreck is. So they've got bits and bobs that they'd been able to haul up, but not much. Very, very little supposed human remains. There's one actually really lovely thing that did survive the implosion, which we showcase.
Absolutely.
Which is a little memento that Sydney has from her dad. And he used to take these styrofoam cups. He'd sort of write, the name and the place and the date of the expedition. And then on descent, the enormous pressure would shrink them. And incredibly, so he had plenty of these from his lifetime of exploring.
Exactly.
But amazingly, the one that he took on that dive on the Titan survived, and the Coast Guard were able to give it to her.
That shocked me. That was the first thing that shocked me watching your story earlier, that nothing else is recovered but a styrofoam cup that's shrunk to half its size.
Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, the laws of the deep sea are, who knows what can happen.
Beyond our expertise.
Well, indeed. But that's a really special memento for her. So that's something that she, brings out and talks about, which is lovely.
Absolutely. One person who has a lot of expertise is James Cameron, the Hollywood director. Fascinating man. Yeah. What was he like to chat to?
Oh, just extraordinary. I mean, he is a friend of 60 Minutes. He's been on the program a couple of times. He loves us, which is great because we love him, Jim Cameron. But he has such an extraordinary depth of knowledge. Not only, as we know, is he, an acclaimed Hollywood director and the Titanic, winning all of its awards, but he himself has been to the Titanic wreck 33 times. In fact, as he says, if you do the maths, he's actually spent more time on that wreck than the captain of the Titanic spent on the ship.
Yeah, that's crazy.
So it is, he knows a lot about that particular wreck site where the Titan was diving to. But more than that, he knows about how to engineer a safe submersible. He has helped design and engineer and build. In fact, it was built in Australia. His Challenger, his deep sea Challenger, was built in a workshop in Leichhardt in Sydney, which he then piloted to the deepest known point on Earth, which is nearly 11 kilometres under the Pacific, the Challenger Deep. So it's hard to overstate the wealth of knowledge that he has, and amazing that this time last year, sort of both those passions, the Titanic and the deep sea engineering and the submersible stuff, came together in this story unlike any other. And so he was obviously called upon straight away for comment. But I think it's not until now, a year on, that he's had time to process and reflect. And he's got a lot to say, and he's got a lot of questions too.
Still.
Yeah.
He's come out swinging, hasn't he?
He's come out swinging, yeah. I mean, the key thing here is, and I didn't realise this, that submersible imploded within hours of descent. So they get them on the ship, they wave them off, big mission, very excited, families are on the mothership. It went down. It was probably an hour 45, 2 hours, and they were all dead. However, from the rest of the media and the world watching, this search and rescue effort went on for days. And as you'd remember, there were countdowns, how many hours of oxygen are left on board, what are they doing in there while they're waiting to be rescued. There were banging noises, which James Cameron has got
more strong views on.
He does not hold back, but he just basically says, it's nonsense. The banging noises could not have been picked up. He says, we knew they were dead, and the Coast Guard didn't pass on critical information that they had that would have said to the families, it's a 99% chance that they've died, and this is a recovery effort. So this went on for like 4 or 5 days until they found the debris field. So he's pretty cranky about that, and rightly so. When you listen to him, he's very convincing.
Well, he had his own source, didn't he? He got the information the next morning.
Yeah, like a US naval intelligence source told him exactly when that implosion was picked up. So the evidence is there, and we have a bit of a look at that in the story. And we do go inside that search and rescue effort as well and talk to just a couple of the key people who were running it. Because to be fair to them, until they found evidence of something, of course they were doing their job. They felt that whilst they didn't have debris, whilst they didn't have evidence that the Titan had blown up or 5 men had died, they would keep searching. And it was such an extraordinary effort. They're so far from anywhere, So first it was aircraft, then they've realised, okay, we've got to get a submersible nearly 4Ks down. That's not very many submersibles in the world that can do that, and certainly not in that area at that time. So they had an unmanned robotic, and that was, flown in and then shipped out, and that deep sea remotely operated vehicle, it's called, the Odysseus-6, didn't actually, start retracing, if you like, the descent of the Titan until about 4 days after. James Cameron said it blew up and there were smithereens on the bottom of the ocean. So there's a few different narratives going on, but I think the pressure's on, the pressure's certainly on the US Coast Guard Investigative Committee, which is running this, which will hold a public hearing. The timeline seems to get pushed back, but the pressure's got to be on OceanGate as well. As I said earlier, the OceanGate boss is not answerable. So.
Well, yeah, he's the only real villain who's been spoken about over the past year, right? But I'm sure families, experts like James Cameron, who are still really frustrated about what went on, they still want to blame someone, don't they?
They do, and it's that funny thing in this community because none of them, even Sidonie, Paul Henri's daughter, who has been grieving for a year and is just so angry and sad, as you would be, to have lost her father in this way. But she still, she understands the very unique personalities that are drawn to this type of extreme exploration. She understands the pull. She grew up with her father going off to the Titanic all the time and bringing back these artefacts. She knew the dangers, he knew the dangers. So even she will say, as much as it is, and I put this to her, an awful cliche, he died doing what he loved, where he loved, and she doesn't want to see, deep sea exploration stopped because of this. Because really OceanGate has already been proven, although obviously the official findings are a long way from out, but it was an outlier. And James Cameron says it was a dangerous, anomalous. This was not the standard. And one of the great points that he made, which has stuck with me, was he said, if you do the stats, you are more safe getting into a commercial submersible and diving under the ocean than you are getting into an Uber with a driver that you've not driven with before.
Really?
Yeah, you are more safe. It is such a safe industry. There are such high safety standards, the materials used, all of those things. And it's really interesting to hear him talk through some of those, like, look at me, breaking the rules, aren't I great, experimental sort of things that we've heard from Stockton Rush. It's quite obvious that they really should never have been allowed to attempt to get to the Titanic when this was a craft that people who dove in it heard the hull cracking years earlier.
And that's probably their frustration, right? That it was peak experts in this field warning them against it. But now, someone like me, I probably wouldn't have gone down there in one of those things anyway. Certainly never will now. Yeah. So that's the PR problem they now have.
It is. And the industry took a real hit. I spoke to Patrick Lay, who runs Triton, which is another big player in the industry, and he works quite closely with James Cameron. He's not in the story, but just on background, because he's a fascinating wealth of information as well. And he said initially they were so worried about, this would gut the industry, and it actually did have a big drop-off effect on submersible tourism, if you like. And he said just in the last 6 months, it's really bounced back. And the feedback he's getting is that people have realised, like, OceanGate was so far away from the engineering and safety standards. It wasn't classed, it wasn't certified. And as you said, you or I wouldn't get in an unclassed or uncertified.
Yeah.
And I think...
Confirmed you wouldn't?
Confirmed I would not. I think the way they got around that at OceanGate is they didn't call them, tourists or passengers. They called them like mission specialists or something.
Well, they all had the passion for it, right? They all just wanted to go. And one of them you mentioned before, PH.
Yeah.
37 times.
Yeah. And he actually was acting as a tour guide of sorts for OceanGate. And I put that to his daughter because I said, someone with your dad's experience and wealth of knowledge, like, how could he have gone on board with OceanGate knowing the risks? And I think she said he was really excited about the new challenge. He was on board to talk to the passengers about what they were going to see and what it meant, which was his absolute area of expertise and love as well. And as James Cameron pointed out, PH, Paul Henri, wasn't an engineer. He was an explorer, and he just wanted to dive, and he just wanted to push the boundaries as well. So yeah, there's a lot of people still grieving and still kind of processing what happened, but also now really keen for answers.
Yeah, you know what, just talking about it, I remember thinking it at the time when we were, all hooked on this story over those days, wanting a good outcome, just being in that submersible at that time, just thinking about it, right, it just sends shivers up the spine.
Yeah, and Sydney made a really interesting point. I said to her, are you kind of annoyed knowing now the naval intelligence that it actually imploded within hours? Your dad was dead. They were all dead. And you had this 4 or 5 days of, oh my gosh, they're going to, she really believed they'd find them alive. And she said to me, she said, a bit of both. In a way, it's harder because it was hope for nothing. But she said also, I felt my dad was alive for 4 more days.
That's heartbreaking.
Which was heartbreaking. She said, for me, that 4 days he was alive. So I had him for 4 days more. Really sad. And you think about the wife of Hamish Harding, the explorer that was on board, and then the Pakistani businessman and his son was only 17. You think about, his mum and wife, what they're still going through as they, wait for answers, because ultimately, as we know, the investigation will go to a public hearing. There'll be findings, but at the end of the day, those men probably shouldn't have gotten on board, and they're not coming back.
Yeah, it's so sad. It brings me to the obvious question, though. I'm speaking to the people you've spoken to. Why do they do this? Why the fascination with the Titanic? Why the fascination with deep sea exploration?
That's something I've been
trying to... Frontier,
isn't it? It is. It's the final frontier. And if you're someone like James Cameron or Paul-Henri Nargeolet and you have this obsession and you get a taste of it and you're in that world, I think there's just this, as he describes it, almost an obligation or responsibility to keep pushing and to keep exploring. And as James Cameron said, it's the ability, although very difficult and dangerous path, to witness history, to hover over the wreck site of, this doomed, 1912, ill-fated shipwreck, to witness it and be part of it. He said to me, why else do people go to the beaches of Normandy and Gettysburg? And it's that sense of seeing what went before. And also I think part of it is the difficulty and the danger of getting there, that there's not a huge amount of people on Earth who, A, can afford to, and B, could be brave enough. I mean, I'm neither of those.
Exactly. Cannot afford it and not brave enough. So
I'll be sitting right here.
James Camerons of the world.
Yeah, that's right. So he's got a lot to say. And I think his final point is really important, that it can be done safely and that we shouldn't lose sight of that as we, wait for the findings of the investigation and we hear what he's got to say about everything that went wrong. It can be done safely. And in fact, he's intending to go back just to kind of make that point to the world.
Yeah, and hopefully those families get some answers too. Old Amelia, thank you. Fascinating stuff.
Thanks.
As always, you can catch Amelia's story on our YouTube channel and 9Now.